Good morning, everyone. My name is Meredith Storm, and I'm the Executive Symposium Articles Editor for the Maryland Law Review. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this snowy, cold morning. We really appreciate it. We have a wonderful group of panelists here with us today, and we are so grateful for their participation and willingness to share their scholarly insights. We're looking forward to it. We have a very full day planned, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our very own Professor Citron, who will kick off today's event.
Yeah, thank you. And alas, we were supposed to be joined by my partner in crime, Bobby Chesney, but wonderful and beloved Professor Chesney is sick. And I talked to him on the phone before he was going to get on the plane in Austin, and he's like, you know what, Danny, I have like high fever, and I feel really ill. And I said, I know you love us, and you want to be here to have the conversation, but you're going home now. Your Jewish booby is saying so, and he laughed. He's like, I always needed one of those. So we love you, Bobby, not to worry, we got this. And we are here to enjoy our conversation together, right, about deepfake. So I'm going to kick us off. But first, I know what Bobby and I would say if he were here, and it is to thank the exquisite Law Review. When I had a conversation with, when Meredith and Caroline and Alex, you know, were started and took over the executive board for the Law Review, they of course, like right away got in touch with me and said, you know, you and Professor Kowarski were their advisors, and let's talk and let's sit down and talk about the symposium. And this was last spring, right? So I think the article Bobby and I wrote was just really a glimmer in our thoughts. We were busily, you know, blogging about it, but we hadn't written it. And I told them a set of ideas, like, how about this, how about that? And I came to deepfakes, and the three of them right away, like eyes wide, said, this is the issue that's going to be current. Like, we know it is. And so they were right? So Axios, we know, just yesterday had a major story about Senator Ben Sass's proposal to criminalize malicious deepfakes, fraudulent malicious deepfakes. So this is definitely an issue we are talking about, right? So I'm going to kick us off, but first saying thank you guys for having the vision and incredible sort of smarts and just devotion and getting this all together and bringing us all together. And Marianne and Jason, don't worry, I'm so happy to see you guys. Come on in. No, we're not calling you out. It's called like this sheer joy of when your friends are all together, right? Okay, so I just messed up my thing. Poor Arthur. This is what happens. I'm like too comfortable in my own school. You know, I ripped out the microphone. Arthur, I love you. I'm so sorry. This is not a deep fake. This is Danielle being an idiot. Why does this feel so make sense? You know me well. Wow. Arthur, I apologize. I owe you, Arthur, a beer. How's that? Magic. Oh, magic. Yay, Arthur, right? I'm so sorry. Okay, I won't touch this thing. I really have to behave myself. So this morning I was listening to, I think maybe Morning Joe, and Senator Angus King was on, and he was responding to the president's assertion that his intelligence chiefs had disagreed with him about his policy towards Syria and ISIS. And the president yesterday said, that's not what they said at the hearing. No, they completely agree with me. And Senator King this morning, when asked about this, said, you know what? You don't have to believe me, listen to the audio. Right? You can believe what your ears and on the video, what your ears and your eyes are telling you. And that captures the idea that film, and so video and audio, incredibly powerful. They elicit a kind of visceral response. So whenever we hear of disinformation, which is of course nothing new, when we hear it or we see it, we tend to believe it, and it becomes kind of inscribed in our memories because it's proof of something happening in the world in the way in which we can just dismiss a rumor, but when we see audio and video, we credit it, right? And so what Senator King captured was, I think, the notion that we do rely in our just human experience on video and audio and their power to tell us what's happened out in the world. And what deepfake technology does, and I'll describe it a little bit, the technology itself, but what it does is insert people and have them doing and saying things that they've never done. So swapping and inserting faces and bodies into sets of events or saying things they never did. And it's a technology that is highly realistic. At this moment in time, when we started writing about this 6 months ago, Ian Goodfellow, a Google researcher, had been working on what's called generative adversarial algorithmic machine learning techniques. And it was a big breakthrough in the technology. And what it does, and I'll describe it a little bit, and I'm not a technologist, but I'm going to do my best to describe the technology for us. But what it does, in a way that doctored videos in the past were pretty easy to debunk. What deepfake technology and generative adversarial techniques allow is to create, with machine learning techniques, doctored audio and video that is incredibly realistic and very difficult to detect. And increasingly, the more sophisticated these technologies are and develop, it's like an arms race of techniques that create deepfakes, altered video and audio, and technologies that detect them. So the big breakthrough over the last year, what a generative adversarial technique does is look at source, it's machine learning or pattern recognition. So you've got source data, let's say it's photos of someone, and the generator mines for patterns of the data set and creates, through the use of the algorithm, generates an image or a video. And then the adversarial algorithm then is subject to and then tests the source, what's created, to find defects in it. And then in an iterative manner, the generator and the adversary are at war with each other, creating an audio and video which is highly, highly realistic and does not have flaws, right? Increasingly so. Now, as I've been told, the most difficult thing to replicate are faces. That in these audio and video, so nothing is perfect. So you have UW researchers who discovered, and Berkeley, who are kind of in the midst of almost a conversation with each other to find defects in these deepfake technologies. So finding veins that they see in the face that are moving not in a way that's consistent. But every time there's a breakthrough in detecting a fake, of course, there's a response, right? So we might envision it as like white hats and black hats in conversation with each other, right? Generating detectors and then creating a new technique for deepfakes that are very difficult to debunk. So I tried my best at channeling Bobby. He always does this part of the talk when we do this together, to describe the technology, which is providing video and audio that is highly realistic, difficult to detect fakes, and having us inserting people doing and saying things that they never said and never did. Okay, so that's the technology. And so the question is, what's the mischief that drove Bobby and I to write about it and worry about it? And so Bobby and I became friends I'm going to blame Ben Winnis for our wonderful friendship. But we met through Ben, and we wanted to work together. Bobby does national security, and I'm a privacy scholar and free speech. And so I sent Bobby a motherboard story about deep fake sex videos. And I said, Bobby, today it's Gal Gadot, and Hermione Granger, whose name I'm afraid, Emma Watson. Tomorrow, it's Trump. And he writes me back and says, this is what we're writing about. So let's just talk about the kind of harm that we might see for individuals and then for society. And then let's puzzle through together the kind of modest way I think law can intervene, technology and the market, and then what do we do when neither law nor markets can solve it as kind of a society, which I think is ultimately our challenge. So for individuals, I'm going to start because my most recent work has been about sexual privacy. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about that deepfake sex video and the ways in which we can harm individuals, and then pull it out a bit to talk about some of the sabotage we might see of even corporate CEOs, ways in which we can sabotage businesses, and then a bit about sort of democracy and national security. Okay, so the deepfake sex video, it goes about 8 months ago, the story from Motherboard, and then Wired follows up about we're seeing Reddits, like subreddits, devoted to deepfake sex videos of celebrities. Now, and the thread, if you had looked at the time, which I did, the subreddits, the conversations on the thread were like, yeah, Gal Gadot, she's hot, look at this, but also exes saying things like, I want to make one of my girlfriend, I only have 30 photos. You think the fake app technology that's available on a desktop would work? And the thread were conversations of individuals like talking about how they wanted to make deepfake sex videos of the girlfriend they had a crush in high school, or the ex, and how, their conversation was, how do we do this? And directing each other to YouTube tutorials. We're instructing them how to use the technology, which if you look today, there are countless YouTube videos on how to create deepfake videos. So, and we have seen illustrations of people, so I'm just going to tell you 2 quick examples. Noelle Martin is a student in Australia. She was 18 when she had posted just pictures of herself on social media. And they were publicly available, and someone who she does not know who it is, a stranger, took those pictures, first just doctored photos of her and inserted her in pornographic images. And then what happened was, next to the pornographic, these were just images, people posted her home address, her cell phone number, where she was a student in Australia. And then, over time, within about 6 months, a deepfake sex video of her appeared being ejaculated on, and then giving oral sex to someone. And then again, were the links to where she lived, her cell phone number, and being inundated with death and rape threats, strangers contacting her for sex. She was a college student in Australia, just an ordinary person. And at times, she went to law enforcement, and she lived in South Wales, and the response was, we don't have a law, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? And 6 months ago, when Bobby and I were first sort of writing our draft and working on this piece, there was a journalist in India, right, Rana Ayub, who was writing about Hindu nationalist politics, and she ticked off whoever she was writing about. She was exploring sort of corruption in Hindu national politics, political parties. And a deepfake sex video of her appeared next to her home address, and it went viral. So first it was like shared in group messages, and then it was posted on Twitter. And then from there, it was released, like it went wild. And she basically went into hiding. She's a journalist, and she had death threats, rape threats, and she, for about 4 months, couldn't write. She couldn't speak or eat. She was terrified, and she said, someone's created and made me a sexual image in ways that scare the living daylights out of me, right? And so just on an individual level, we see the deepfake sex video being incredibly intimidating. I feel like I'm going to invoke Marianne, your unwilling avatar, that sort of wonderful image, disturbing, but ways in which we make people sex objects and avatars that they never chose, right? And is disabling. If it's in a Google search of your name, can ensure you don't get a job, like find a date, right? All the ways in which, we know our Google search of our name as our CV can make it impossible for individuals to make a name for themselves, to get jobs, to keep jobs, right, and to have a social life and engage. So that's sort of what got Bobby and I first engaged in the issue, because it was the most prominent in the conversation, right? And we can imagine that kind of sabotage for imagine the night before IPO. A deep fake video of the CEO comes out of the CEO soliciting a child prostitute or doing drugs, or saying something he shouldn't say in a way that upends the IPO, right? And yes, the next day or two we could debunk the story, or even a week, but there goes the IPO, right? The faith in the marketplace for the CEO is wrecked, right? So depending on the timing of the release of the deep fake, you can time it so you can really hijack economic decisions, right, and people's lives, right? So that's the story of like the individual, though of course with a societal impact, but the kind of individual mischief and for corporate mischief. And then the next question we asked, and this is Bobby's expertise on national security, is making a deep fake video, right, that is in the middle of, let's say, diplomatic negotiations, very sensitive ones, and you slip a deep fake video of an adversary or someone across the table that shows they're disingenuous, they're not interested in making a meaningful deal, and that scuttles the diplomacy. And that's like, if you think about it, the least violent of possibilities. But imagine a deep fake video that's released amidst, let's say, in Gaza, right, of Israeli soldiers murdering a Palestinian young child. And already there are riot conditions, right, and the violence explodes. And I guess I thought of my city, Baltimore, the day that Freddie Gray is killed. The next day, following Michael Brown's murder, right, our city kind of explodes with grief. Imagine the deep fake video of our mayor at the time saying things like, who cares about, something that's so inflammatory that we had a little bit of violent disturbance here in the city, but imagine exacerbated 10 times, right? The incitement to violence, like released at just the right moment, right? That can disrupt not only just the economics of a city, right? Destroy the burning of things, right? But people can get physically killed, right? If timed right. And what Bobby and I talk about, the idea of trust decay and truth decay. That degrading we're in a moment where we're having a hard time trusting each other, right? And what deep fake videos do is create deep distrust in the conversation in ways that are difficult to debunk. And then the trust in our institutions. So imagine, and I think I prayed the night before the most recent midterms, that we wouldn't see a deep fake about Stacey Abrams, right, or Andrew Gilliam, right, that would throw off the election. And we're hearing conversations that are with the national security community about concerns for 2020, right, and ways in which we could see an election thrown. Doesn't mean we wouldn't be able to debunk a video the night before. We can't debunk it the night before, right? It goes viral, the election is swayed, and then we find out it was fake a couple of days later. We can't redo an election, right? So there are ways in which, if we time it just right, the deep fake can be incredibly disruptive to our democracy. So we've got, individual harms, and harms that, of course, resonate throughout society when increasingly, imagine the deep fake video for individuals is mostly women, right? So, of course, has an impact on all women, right? And it has an impact on our economy. But more broadly, society and the kind of compact we have and shared trust and shared sense of reality, right? To have a democracy, you need a shared set of truths we can debate. And what the deep fake video does is undermine, right, the possibility of having that conversation in a way that we can point to things and say, they're empirical truths, right? There are frankly under assault already, and the deepfake video exacerbates that problem. So what do we do, right? It's so funny, everyone wants to say there's easy answers, and as in all really confounding questions, there are no easy answers here, unfortunately, right? And the more that we talk about the deepfake phenomenon, this is something Bobby coined, I love this notion of the liar's dividend, and we've seen our president do it, and so let me explain what the liar's dividend is when people, when faced with genuine audio and video that they don't want to be associated with, imagine Access Hollywood tape, you can say, that's not me, it's a deep fake, right? And we saw the president say the Lester Holt interview. That never happened. He tried it, it didn't work. He gave up on it, right? But when liars can invoke the deepfake phenomenon to escape accountability for truth, that's when we're really in trouble, right? So what do we do, right? Often you talk to technologists, and there are a lot of really interesting people in the technical community working on that arms race to figure out digital authentication methods so that we could look to an audio and video, say, well, there is a watermark that says it was created at this date and time, and we can trust that provenance. And so companies like TruePic and others are really genuinely working hard on this issue. But you got to get then widespread adoption and having platforms agree to that widespread adoption, right, of only showing video and audio that come with that digital provenance. And we're certainly by no means there yet, nor do platforms have any pressure to internalize that as their norm, right? So we are in an arms race, right, for authentication, and I think we're going to stay there for a while. So at least in a liminal period, we don't have a technical solution, right? And then the question is, what about law, right? People always look to lawyers and we're like, expect us to solve anything. Or this is Ed Felton's, we call it Ed Felton's third law, which is in any tech policy debate, the engineers and computer scientists look at the lawyers and say, you got this, right? And the lawyers look at the technologists and say, yeah, no, you have this, right? And this is like a marriage. We got to work together on this because we don't have it, right? So law, yes. Individuals could bring suits against if they could ever find their individual perpetrator, and that perpetrator is in the United States, and they can pay for counsel. That's a lot of ifs, right? If you could find someone, you could sue them for defamation, right? Even if it's a celebrity, you can sue them for defamation because clearly, unless it's a parody, you can show they made it with actual malice. They know they created the deep fake, right? And certainly you have deep fake sex videos, and I know we're going to have interesting conversations about the free expression protections, but there are certain areas of law we could use, right? There are criminal statutes that relate to impersonation, that relate to the impersonation of government officials whose First Amendment grounds we don't doubt, right? There are fraud statutes, but the difficulty is finding the creators, right, and bringing law to bear against them, and assuming they're in the United States. Now, what about the platforms? And I know we're going to spend lots of wonderful time talking about platforms. Now, platforms, so online service providers and ISPs, currently enjoy a fairly broad sweeping immunity from liability for user-generated content. And the SaaS bill, which I hope we get to talk about, right, does address changing that immunity because it's a federal criminal law, and providers are not immune don't enjoy Section 230 immunity from liability for federal criminal statutes. And it does address distributors who intend to, who have actual knowledge of a deep fake, and then who intend to facilitate a crime or tort. I don't think this thing is going anywhere, right? I don't think the statute's getting passed. But, and something Ben Wittes and I have proposed that Bobby and I embrace in this article, is that Section 230 immunity should be conditional. Right now, it's a free pass and provides no incentives per platforms to protect the vulnerable, right? So there are platforms and sites whose whole business model is abuse and destruction, right? They make money off of eyeballs, and this stuff goes viral, right? And we tend to click on what's salacious. So Ben and I argued that we should have it be conditional upon reasonable practices in the face of illegality. And I think we're going to start having that conversation about Section 230 immunity. But law's a modest and blunt tool, right? And so we've got market efforts, which are amidst developing, right? Law is a very modest tool, right? If we don't think, at least as to individuals, that harassment and stalking statutes and all of the 41 plus DC, Marianne Franks has like single-handedly ensured that we have laws that criminalize non-consensual pornography. We haven't seen them invoked, right? because as much as we educate, when it comes to gendered crimes, we pay no attention, right? So having the laws on the books, we can't rely on law. Like, it's not that I want us to do it, I want us to try, right? But it's going to be modest. And the market solutions are modest. And one thing we do talk about in the paper that we do very much worry about is the possibility that we might start self-surveilling, like hiring life logging services, and this is especially true for folks like CEOs, to prove where we were and what we were doing at all time. And as a privacy scholar, I have to say this is a nightmare, right? The idea that we would, so we can debunk the deep fake, self-surveil, and then have a record of it held by a corporation, man, that's like a honeypot of honeypots for hackers, right? So, you know, that possible privacy self-chosen invasion sounds like, I know people have Alexas in their homes. What are you doing? Can you throw those things out? No, seriously, I went to my sister's house. She's an OBGYN. I was like, girl, seriously? Like, I mean, I literally wanted to put that thing in the trash. Like, the idea that we would have an Alexa, right, on us, taping us, sounds insane. You know, law enforcement officers, there's a move to do that, right, for public policy reasons, right, to tape their actions. So it's not a crazy idea, right, this life logging notion. So in the end of the day, right, Bobby and I don't have clear answers, right, but we have provocations. And so that's why we wanted to bring the smartest people together in the room to talk about the privacy, the free speech, the IP, the national security implications of these images and these videos and audio, to have a meaningful conversation and help us, right, with this. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. How am I doing on time? What time is it? We're good? 5 minutes? Oh my golly, I talked that long? Wow, okay. I was saying because poor Bobby was sick, I was like, Bobby and I usually do this together, and he tends to sort of lead it for us, because thank God, I'm always like, I'm doing too many other things, and Bobby's like, no, I got this. Like, I'll just ask you questions as it arises. So I was channeling us, hopefully it was fine. But we did take up the time. But so any questions before we move on to we have 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so we've got questions. So please, and what's great is that we have panels of people who think really deeply about this, so we can engage with them rather than just hearing from me, right, about this conversation that we're having. I know we have questions. Should I call on people? Because I know everyone in the audience. Kate. Kate Klonick from St. John's.
So
love you.
Yes.
Okay.
I love you too.
Okay. This is not an ordinary conference.
Yeah. No. There's. So I'm kind of curious. I was recently at Twitter, and someone approached me and kind of said, "Listen, I heard you mention deepfakes. I was talking about it in my talk, and they said I'm working on a technology company that is going to basically do it's like the equivalent. That's actually I forget his name. The guy from Dartmouth that created PhotoDNA.
Hani.
Yeah, thank you, yeah. And he's like on the board, and he's like, well, we're going to basically do PhotoDNA for video, and we're going to put all of it in blockchain, which was like the first time.
Isn't that always the answer?
Yeah,
Can
and
we
so
please say it at every conference.
And so
at every conference.
Okay, so
the
just like
blockchain.
Alexa,
Thank you.
I usually am just kind of like, when I hear blockchain, I'm like, we can put that in the garbage.
Yeah.
And but I actually was like, well, if there is some type of security, I don't actually think that this is but I'm curious, since it's going to come up, I thought I would be the first one to bring it up.
You dropped the B-bomb,
I
right?
did. Is blockchain the answer to this, Danielle?
Oh my golly, and I have the same revulsion that you do, and then being at, I feel like, Alan, we were at remember we were at ASU at that conference, the Governance Technologies Conference, and wasn't blockchain like in everything that everyone said every second? And it was painful, right? Okay, so the answer is no, right? Having a secure sort of place in which we can store data isn't going to solve this question of authentication and provenance. And it may be that it may be part of a solution, though I'm going to doubt it, but it could be part of it. Right? I'm not gonna turn my nose up at nothing until, right? Like, I'm ready for technical help, right? But it's true and Trupik, yeah, right. And even Hani Farid says it's an arms race. Does that make sense? Like in some recent interviews, and he's so brilliant, and he's why we have photo DNA for child pornography. But even the most cutting edge, interesting folks at Berkeley and Google and UW, folks who work on this 24/7, say we're not quite there yet with the answer to that arms race. Yeah. Jess, you want to? Jessica Silby, Northeastern, introducing everyone.
Hi, okay.
Yeah, okay.
I wondered if you could historicize the problem of deep fakes a little bit, and just if there are lessons to be learned from how, over time, we have dealt with things like this, and whether this is definitely a paradigm shift, or whether we can borrow lessons from the past.
Yeah, so I was talking to my colleague Mark Graber yesterday, who's a historian and political scientist of the framers era, and he said, this is no different, right, than when we had one sort of major news source, if you could call it that, right, that had dominance over a conversation, and there was fakery or disinformation, right, that it would capture us. And I said, no, you're right that, of course, disinformation is nothing new, but some of the difficulty, and you think about, we went through a period of time, and let's just bring us to the 20th century, where we had trusted, it may not be BBC, but we had trusted platforms that took the mission of truth identification seriously. And so we had trusted resources, centralized, yes, but there weren't just one. It wasn't just the one paper that could kind of dominate 18th century conversation, but it was ABC and CBS and NBC, and then increasingly in 80s, CNN, right? We begin to create diversity there. But we did have gatekeepers, right? And the problem now is the diversity of gatekeepers, and plus the fact that our gatekeepers are completely immune from liability in a way that CBS, NBC, ABC, New York Times, and Washington Post don't enjoy total immunity from liability, right? And it doesn't mean they're not different kinds of actors. But I think the lesson is, and law moves like a pendulum, right? We kind of overreact, we underreact, and hopefully we move somewhere in the middle with new technologies. That the lesson, at least from the 20th century, is that law does serve an important role. And when we're lawless, the idea that we're going to have a market answer is to a fundamentally broken marketplace, I think the lesson is that can't be the answer. I guess that would be my lesson. So should we move on to our next panel, or how are we doing on time, friends? I look to my bosses in the back. Oh my gosh. Okay, Ari. New York Law School. I'm introducing everyone. You guys will forgive me.
Hi, I'm Ari. What is the difference in terms of implications for law and for society between deep fakes and fake news?
Yep. Yeah.
If you're going to frame part of the problem as trust and truth decay, all of that applies to fake news.
Oh yeah.
So is really the only difference the fact that there's a visceral difference between reading something and seeing something? And if that's the case, I'm not so sure that psychologists who have done studies about how we respond to things would agree.
Right.
But is it also the difference between, is the line about deepfake videos can be highly sexualized when there's something special about sex, which is very different than a story or a fake news story about a presidential candidate running a child pedophilia ring?
And so I would say that it's not a different problem, it's part of the problem of fake news, right? It is an exacerbation. People always ask me, like, why do you in your work often focus on the ways in which technology undermines our commitments, whether it's to equality, to privacy, to speech, right? This technology is part of the fake news phenomenon, and fundamentally, and we certainly saw this in the eve of the election for the French election for Macron, disinformation that were doctored images that if they had been more interesting, frankly, could have really upended their election. So the deepfake phenomenon, it's not that it is a different problem, it's part of that problem, and it exacerbates it. And you're right that social psychology would tell us that there are all sorts of lies that embed themselves in our memory, and video and audio and fakery that's just words can both do it, especially if they affirm our cognitive biases. So what is different and what is really important and interesting here is a combination of a number of things, which is the diffusion of the technology. It's going to be in everybody's hands, right? It doesn't require you to have like a PhD in CS, right? The virality of it, and especially when it is tied to something that seems wrong. It doesn't have to be sex, but if it is, seems at all salacious, and that could, so negative and novel, there's kind of two typologies that we've seen in research. That is what goes viral, and that's what we click on if it's negative and novel. So political scientists have done a bunch of studies about we're actually the bug, human beings, not bots. We click on stories which are novel and negative, not the bots, like in the analysis of the 2016 election. We're the problem, right? So that, I think that story about President Trump getting approval from the Pope, remember, like 1/5 of the electorate saw it? No, are you guys with me? So, right, 79% of the people believe that story. Can we have a moment? Like, what is wrong with us? So you have that combination, right, of, and this makes me think of Ben and Gabby Blum's book on the future of violence, like the diffusion of the technology in everybody's hands, the virality and the ability to make it go viral with platforms that aren't really doing anything for the most part, right? And the way in which the content, if it affirms our cognitive biases and it's novel and new, we're going to pass it on, right? So in that sense, it exacerbates the problem of fake news. It's not just that it's the audio and video, it's that combination. Though I think you're right that the image part of it is an important part of it because of its sort of viscerality, right? Woody? Northeastern, we have serious Northeastern rep. Oh, Olivier, my alma mater, Fordham Law School, yes.
Hey,
Sorry.
Hey, Danielle.
Hey, Beth.
So, Woody, sorry, I have the microphone, but I forget. You started with, and you just repeated something related, but you started with, the possibility or the threat of, in the wake of an election,
Yeah.
right? This is the urgency of the problem. Like, having a deep fake disrupt the ways in which people think about candidates.
Yep.
And there's something about that immediacy that I think is really interesting. And I'm curious to hear you just say a word or two about like media blackouts. I mean,
Yeah.
they're-
Then
they're-
maybe, and can we follow, if it's okay, I promise I'm not asking you a question, but on your panel, because I'm not a media or telecom scholar or guru, you know what I'm saying? Can we follow up on that question, right? Because and we know in France, isn't it true that I think it's a weird timing, like 44 hours, or it has a weird, it's not 24 or 48, right? It's this like 44 hours blackout, right? About news about an election. And in part, that's why the dump of the doctored photos from Russia weren't as effective, right? Because they do have that media blackout. And I guess the question of could we regulate it, I think we can, but because we do also, but I'm going to defer to you. I do think we should talk about that. Because as we put on the table different kinds of both agency kind of rulemaking responses like FCC, FTC, we should maybe, and then congressional responses, like we should have a conversation about the mainstream media and would it even do anything? Do you know what I'm saying? Like now everybody's watching Chris Hayes and Ari Melber and, Rachel Maddow in this moment, but really also Twitter and Facebook, right? And so it's got to be a combination of things, but the question is, can we do it, and then would it make a real difference with mainstream, media? Woody?
Hi, thank you, Danielle. I had a question about the actual benefits of deepfakes because a lot of this discussion seems to hinge upon the fact that there is something worth preserving. In other words, we can't just sort of nuke all deepfakes.
Right, and we don't want to do that.
And then as you if you might sort of talk about that for a little while, could you also then talk about possible difficulty in line drawing exercises between
Yeah.
differentiating between positive uses and what we would say would be negative uses.
Great. Okay, so just a little bit on the really incredible, powerful potential of deep fakes. It's a story that Bobby often tells because a friend of his has ALS, and that folks have used deep fake audio to mine audio from the past of someone who can no longer speak, but who can then type what the person is saying, and the audio is the voice. And what a gift for the person and their loved ones, right? And the same is true. So a man was writing in Men's Journal about how the potential for, he was a quadriplegic, of a deepfake sex video of himself with his lover. To see himself making love, even though he couldn't, was a gift too, right? And so we can imagine its personal implications as well as the educational implications, right? Like you could have a really interesting, I loved history class, but not everyone does. And so the interesting deep fake, of the battle scene, and then the person leaping out and asking questions, get yourself in the video, the teacher, so that we can make history come alive in ways that, and educate people. There's a deep fake of Obama teaching people about the peril of deep fakes. He didn't do that, right? So there are ways in which we can, right, use video in really pro-social ways. And so I think the line drawing exercise, and I'm looking forward, Thomas, and I don't know if you're going to talk about your piece for the Maryland Law Review today. I hope you do, because we're going to talk a lot about, right, parity and commitments to the First Amendment and the difficulty of line drawing when we're talking about political figures, right, and celebrities, and ways in which make a really meaningful contribution for parody and satire, which is, I think, why Bobby and I are so careful in our piece to say we're not calling for a ban, nor could we if we were being realistic about First Amendment commitments and the doctrine. But that's why we're so careful about law's modesty.
Thank you.
Oh, Jason. Sorry, my former student, beloved former student. Do you want to tell us, everyone, what you're doing now? Am I allowed?
I'm an attorney at the DOD.
Yes.
So
Department of
Danielle,
Defense.
you talked in
Yes.
your opening remarks about, or alluded to the fact that there's no deep fix to deep fakes. And you talked about
Right.
the diffusion of technology. As we see the democratization of what I think you get to describe as like the dumpster fire of Turing tests,
Yeah.
despite all of our mitigations, legal, technological, are we eventually just going to have to live as a society on some level, like with lies?
Right.
And how do we adapt to that?
Right, and I think it's a wonderful way, if that's where we're ending, it's a wonderful way to end this conversation, right? That the very notion that we've always lived with disinformation and lies, right? Malicious, with scienter lies. And as a society, how do we move forward, right? In that space and moment, and I think important recognition that you have us engage in, right? And I think that is going to have to be part of our ultimate conversation about, because we've long lived with disinformation. And I think having people who have the bully pulpit, right, who we look up to, whether it's the CEO of Twitter or, I'm not going to say Starbucks, to some other CEO, right, or it's government actors, right, people we really believe in, having conversations about truths and, right, and science and belief and expertise. We're going to, I think, have to have an important kind of come to Jesus moment, because we do need to have education and talk about falsehoods and their significance, right? So I think we are part, I hope, we are part of an important conversation that I think it has to be longstanding and isn't going to be over anytime soon. So thank you for that question. See how smart my students are at Maryland, just saying. Is that it? Are we
Yep.
good?
Thank
Okay,
you
so
so much,
everyone.
Professor Citron.